Bound by Western Land. Delilah Tate had always known men like Silas Hollis were dangerous. But when he cornered her in the moonlit barn, his hands warm against hers, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath fanning against her skin. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured, "and I'll start thinking you want trouble." Chapter 1. The Widow of Whispering Pines. The dust swirled around Delilah Tate's worn leather boots, a miniature desert cyclone mirroring the turmoil inside her. It had been 3 years since the fever took Thomas, 3 years since she'd been anything but the Widow Tate, a title whispered with a mix of pity and respect in the small, unforgiving town of Whispering Pines. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth, baking the wooden planks of her porch until they radiated heat like a blacksmith's forge. She squinted, her eyes, the color of faded denim, tracing the familiar line of the horizon where the rust-colored mesas met the impossibly blue sky. Delilah was a woman built for resilience, not beauty, though time and hardship had etched a certain weathered grace onto her features. Her hands, calloused from years of working the ranch alongside Thomas, were strong and capable. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, usually pulled back in a tight braid that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She wore a simple, faded calico dress, practical and unadorned, the only concession to vanity a small silver locket that held a miniature portrait of Thomas, worn smooth from years of her thumb tracing its edges. The ranch, Whispering Pines, had been Thomas's dream, a hard-won patch of land carved out of the wilderness. Now, it was her burden, her responsibility, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and what she was desperately trying to hold on to. The cattle were restless, lowing mournfully in the distance, their cries carried on the dry wind. The well was running low, the creek bed cracked and dry. Every day was a struggle, a fight against the elements, against the loneliness, against the creeping despair that threatened to swallow her whole. She'd tried. Lord, how she'd tried to keep Thomas's dream alive. She'd hired hands, unreliable drifters mostly, who came and went like tumbleweeds, leaving her with empty promises and dwindling supplies. She'd bargained with the merchants in town, their faces etched with a mixture of condescension and greed, knowing she was at their mercy. She'd even swallowed her pride and asked for help from her brother, Caleb, a stern, unforgiving man who'd never approved of her marriage to Thomas, a man he considered beneath their family. Caleb, with his sprawling ranch and his cold, calculating eyes, had offered assistance, but his price was too high. He wanted Whispering Pines, wanted to absorb it into his own empire, leaving Delilah with nothing but a pittance and the bitter taste of defeat. She'd refused, of course, clinging to the last vestiges of her independence, even as the vultures circled. The sound of approaching hooves broke her reverie. Delilah straightened, her hand instinctively moving to the worn leather holster at her hip, a habit ingrained from years of living on the edge of civilization. She didn't recognize the rider, a tall, lean figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He rode with an easy grace, his posture suggesting both confidence and caution. As he drew closer, she could make out the details, a weathered hat casting a shadow over his face, a dark bandana covering his lower features, a rifle strapped across his back. He reined in his horse, a magnificent chestnut mare, at the edge of her property, his eyes, dark and unreadable, taking in the scene, the rundown ranch house, the parched fields, the weary woman standing on the porch. He dismounted slowly, his movements fluid and deliberate, the spurs on his boots jingling softly in the stillness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine, despite her apprehension. It was a voice that had known hardship, a voice that hinted at secrets and danger. He removed his hat, revealing a face that was both rugged and strikingly handsome. His hair was dark, almost black, streaked with a touch of silver at the temples, framing a face etched with the lines of a life lived outdoors. His eyes, the color of dark amber, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a hint of weariness, perhaps, or a flicker of something warmer, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Delilah remained on the porch, her hand still resting on the butt of her revolver. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her chest. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I am. My apologies, ma'am. I saw the sign. Whispering Pines. It's a fitting name." His gaze swept over the landscape, the dry wind whispering through the sparse trees. "State your business," Delilah demanded, her eyes narrowed. She'd dealt with enough drifters and opportunists to know that a handsome face and a polite demeanor could hide a multitude of sins. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I'm looking for work. I heard you might be needing a hand." Delilah felt a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by a wave of suspicion. "Heard where?" He gestured vaguely towards the town. "Around. Word travels fast in these parts, especially about a widow woman struggling to keep her ranch afloat." His words, though true, felt like an intrusion, a violation of her privacy. She bristled, her pride stung. "I'm managing," she said, her voice tight. He didn't reply, simply held her gaze, his eyes searching, probing. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, the wind carrying the scent of dust and sage. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I can help you, ma'am. I'm good with cattle, horses, and other things." The last words hung in the air, ambiguous and unsettling. Delilah studied him, trying to read his intentions, trying to discern whether he was a threat or a salvation. She was desperate. That was undeniable. But desperation could lead to foolish choices, choices that could cost her everything. She thought of Thomas, of his dreams, of the life they had built together. She thought of the locket she wore, the weight of it against her skin, a constant reminder of her loss and her determination. The light began to fade more rapidly, making it hard to truly capture the full color of his eyes. She had only moments to decide. I don't know," she said, her voice betraying her uncertainty. "I don't trust easily." He gave a small, almost sad smile. "I understand, ma'am. Trust is a precious commodity in these parts. Hard to come by, even harder to keep." He paused, then added, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind, "But sometimes it's the only thing worth fighting for." He looked at her, the last of the sun reflecting the deep amber, a hint of something unreadable in the depths. Chapter 2. A Stranger's Shadow in the Dusk. His name was Silas. Silas Hollis. He offered it up with a slight tilt of his head, a gesture that was both casual and guarded. Delilah repeated it silently, testing the sound of it on her tongue, the feel of it in her mind. It suited him, she thought, strong and a little bit mysterious, like the man himself. The name carried with it a certain weight, a hint of the unknown that both intrigued and unsettled her. She hadn't agreed to hire him, not yet. But she hadn't sent him away either. The desperation gnawing at her, the relentless pressure of keeping Whispering Pines afloat, warred with her ingrained caution, her deep-seated distrust of strangers. The setting sun cast long, dancing shadows across the porch, making it difficult to read his expression, to decipher the truth behind his dark amber eyes. "I can offer you room and board," Delilah said finally, her voice still laced with suspicion. "And a small wage if you prove your worth." She emphasized the if, making it clear that she wouldn't be taken advantage of. She'd learned that lesson the hard way more than once. Silas nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's more than fair, ma'am. I'm not looking for charity. Just a chance to earn my keep." He spoke with a quiet confidence that both impressed and irritated her. It was the confidence of a man who knew his own capabilities, a man who was used to getting his way. But there was also a hint of weariness in his voice, a shadow of something that suggested he wasn't as impervious as he appeared. Delilah gestured towards the barn, a weathered structure that stood a short distance from the house. "You can stable your horse there. There's a cot in the tack room. It's not much, but it's dry." "It'll do just fine," Silas replied, his eyes following her gesture. He led his mare towards the barn, his movements smooth and efficient, the spurs on his boots jingling softly in the twilight. Delilah watched him go, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake, that she was letting a wolf into the fold. But she was also desperate, clinging to the fragile hope that he might be the answer to her prayers, the lifeline she so desperately needed. She went inside, the familiar scent of her home, a mix of wood smoke and old leather, offering a small measure of comfort. She lit a kerosene lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the simple, rustic furnishings. The house was small, just a few rooms, but it was filled with memories, echoes of a life that was gone. She sat down at the kitchen table, a worn wooden table that had been the center of their lives, the place where they'd shared meals, made plans, and dreamed their dreams. She ran her hand over the smooth, worn surface, feeling the ghosts of Thomas's touch, the warmth of his presence. A wave of loneliness washed over her, so intense it almost took her breath away. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She was tired, bone-tired, of the struggle, of the loneliness, of the constant fear that she was going to lose everything. She opened the locket she wore, gazing at the miniature portrait of Thomas. His face, young and handsome, smiled back at her, a reminder of a time when life had been simpler, when she hadn't been alone. "What should I do, Thomas?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Am I making a mistake? Is he dangerous?" Of course, there was no answer. Only the silence of the empty house, the whisper of the wind outside. She closed the locket, the cold metal against her skin a stark reminder of her reality. She got up and started preparing a simple supper, beans and cornbread, the same meal she'd eaten every night for weeks. She moved mechanically, her mind still preoccupied with the stranger in her barn, with the risk she was taking, with the fragile hope that he might be her salvation. As she ate, she listened to the sounds of the night, the hooting of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whinny of Silas's mare in the barn. She wondered about him, about his past, about the secrets he carried. She wondered why he'd come to Whispering Pines, why he'd chosen to seek work on a struggling ranch run by a solitary widow. After supper, she went outside, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see him again, to gauge his presence, to reassure herself that he wasn't a figment of her imagination, a desperate hallucination brought on by loneliness and despair. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating the barn, the fields, the distant mesas. She saw him standing near the corral, leaning against the fence, his silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky. He was smoking a cigarette, the small red glow of the ember a tiny point of light in the vast darkness. He turned as she approached, his eyes catching the moonlight, reflecting a glimmer of something she couldn't quite define. He didn't speak, simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Delilah stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with a tension that was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. It was the first full moon since that kiss in the barn. She didn't know what compelled her to remind herself of it. He took a drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling up into the night air. "Old habits," he replied, his voice low and husky. "Hard to break." She nodded, understanding more than he knew. She had her own old habits, her own ghosts that haunted her sleep. "What kind of other things are you good at?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It was a bold question, a dangerous question, but she needed to know, needed to understand the risk she was taking. He looked at her, his eyes holding hers in the moonlight. A faint smile played on his lips, a smile that was both enigmatic and a little bit dangerous. "Things a woman like you might need," he said, his voice soft, almost a caress. "Things a ranch like this might require." The air crackled with a new tension, the meaning in his words both a challenge and a promise. The breeze picked up, making the long shadows twist like dark ribbons, whispering against the night. Chapter 3. The Price of Trust on the Frontier. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vast expanse of pale blue, the air still holding the chill of the night. Delilah awoke before sunrise, her sleep troubled and fragmented, filled with half-formed dreams and lingering anxieties. She lay in bed for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, the crowing of a rooster, the lowing of cattle, the distant whinny of a horse, and the quiet, steady chop of an axe. She rose and dressed quickly, pulling on her worn work clothes, her movements automatic, her mind already preoccupied with the day ahead. She had a ranch to run, a stranger to assess, and a future to secure. The weight of it all pressed down on her, a familiar burden that she carried with stoic resilience. When she stepped outside, she saw Silas already at work, splitting wood near the barn. He moved with an effortless grace, his muscles rippling beneath his shirt, the axe rising and falling with a rhythmic precision that spoke of years of experience. He was shirtless, the early morning sun glinting off his tan skin, his back and shoulders corded with muscle. Delilah watched him for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. There was a raw, primal power about him, a physicality that was both intimidating and strangely alluring. She'd seen plenty of men working shirtless, but there was something different about Silas, something that stirred a long-dormant ember within her, a flicker of something she thought she'd buried with Thomas. He paused in his work, sensing her presence. He turned, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his dark amber eyes meeting hers. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement, but didn't speak. "You're up early," Delilah said, her voice a little unsteady. "Habit," he replied, his gaze lingering on her face. "And there's plenty to be done." She nodded, gesturing towards the woodpile. "I appreciate that." The wood was getting low. "I noticed," he said, his eyes taking in the rundown state of the ranch, the neglected fences, the parched fields. He didn't comment, but his silence spoke volumes. They stood for a moment, the unspoken tension between them simmering in the morning air. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut wood and the earthy aroma of the horses. The only sounds came from the gentle morning breeze and their breathing. Delilah broke the silence, her voice businesslike. "I need to check the well. The water level's been dropping steadily." Silas nodded. "I'll come with you. Might need an extra pair of hands." They walked together towards the well, located a short distance from the house. Delilah appreciated his offer of help, but she was also wary, acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the way he moved, of the way he looked at her. The well was indeed low, the water level significantly lower than it had been the previous week. Delilah frowned, her worry deepening. Without water, the ranch was doomed. "We'll need to ration," she said, her voice tight with concern. "And pray for rain." Silas examined the well, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There might be a blockage. Or a leak. I'll take a look." He removed his shirt completely, tossing it aside, and began to inspect the well, his movements methodical and efficient. Delilah watched him, her gaze drawn to the play of muscles across his back, the strength and grace of his body. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He worked for over an hour, his body glistening with sweat, his muscles straining with the effort. Delilah assisted him, handing him tools, holding ropes, her hands brushing against his on occasion, sending a jolt of awareness through her. Finally, he straightened, wiping his face with a bandana. "Found the problem. A crack in the casing. It's not a major leak, but it's enough to cause a significant drop in the water level." "Can you fix it?" Delilah asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He nodded. "I can, but it'll take some time. And I'll need some materials. I saw some scrap metal and leather in the barn. Might be able to use that." "Take whatever you need," Delilah said, her relief evident. She was beginning to trust him, to rely on his skills, his competence. But a small voice of caution still whispered in the back of her mind, reminding her of the risks, of the potential for betrayal. He went into the well and started working and fixing the crack. Delilah had time to think while he worked. She thought of her brother, Caleb. of the offer of assistance he made that felt more like a takeover. She also thought of the rumors that had been spreading around town. Talk of a gang of outlaws operating in the area, preying on isolated ranches, stealing cattle, and leaving a trail of violence and fear. The sheriff, a weary, disillusioned man named Bartlett, had warned her to be careful, to be vigilant. He'd offered to send a deputy out to her ranch, but she'd refused, clinging to her independence, her stubborn pride. She glanced towards the barn, where Silas was working. He was a stranger, a man with a mysterious past, a man who could be dangerous. But he was also the only person who'd offered to help her, the only person who seemed capable of saving Whispering Pines. The sun beat down on her, the heat reflecting the turmoil and uncertainty in her soul. She wanted to take another look at Silas, but she didn't trust herself. The pull was starting to be too strong. She stayed by the well, waiting. As the sun climbed higher, casting its harsh light on the unforgiving landscape, Delilah made a decision. She would trust Silas for now. She had no other choice. But she would also be watchful, wary, her hand never far from the revolver at her hip. It was the price of survival on the frontier, the price of trust in a world where danger lurked around every corner and every helping hand could conceal a hidden blade. She could hear him start to emerge from the well, the sound of the rope and wood creaking. The decision was made. Chapter 4. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The repair to the well took the better part of the day. Silas worked tirelessly, his movements precise and economical, his focus unwavering. Delilah assisted him as best she could, her initial apprehension slowly giving way to a grudging respect for his skill and determination. She found herself watching him, observing the way he moved, the way he solved problems, the quiet strength that emanated from him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Silas finally finished the repair. He emerged from the well, covered in dirt and sweat, his muscles aching, but a look of satisfaction on his face. "That should hold," he said, his voice hoarse from exertion. "We'll need to monitor it, but it should be good for now." Delilah felt a surge of relief, a lifting of the burden that had been weighing her down. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He gave a slight shrug, dismissing her gratitude. "Just doing what needs to be done." They walked back towards the house together, the silence between them comfortable now, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of hard work. The sky was ablaze with color, the setting sun painting the clouds in shades of orange, red, and purple. "You're good with your hands," Delilah said, breaking the silence. "Have you always worked on ranches?" He paused, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "Not always," he replied, his voice low and guarded. "I've done a lot of things." She sensed a story there, a hidden past that he was reluctant to reveal. She didn't press him, respecting his privacy, but her curiosity was piqued. They reached the house, and Delilah gestured towards the porch. "I'll make some supper. You must be starving." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I am. And I appreciate the offer." She went inside, leaving him on the porch to wash up. She prepared a simple meal, stew and cornbread, the familiar routine grounding her, calming her nerves. She set the table, 2 places, a small act that felt strangely significant, a break from the solitude she'd grown accustomed to. They ate together, the silence punctuated by the clinking of forks and the occasional comment about the food or the weather. Delilah found herself studying Silas, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic facade. He was a puzzle, a mixture of strength and vulnerability, of confidence and regret. After supper, they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The night was clear and cool, the vast expanse of the sky studded with millions of twinkling stars. The silence returned, but it was different now, less charged, more companionable. "Tell me about yourself, Silas," Delilah said, her voice soft, inviting. She felt a need to know him, to understand the forces that had shaped him, the secrets he carried. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs before he began to speak. "I was born in Texas," he began, his voice a low rumble. "My father was a rancher, a hard man, a good man. He taught me everything I know about horses, cattle, and life." He paused, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "He died when I was young.
Arrêt d'un accident.
Broke his neck." Delilah felt a pang of sympathy for him, understanding the pain of loss, the void left by a parent's death. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He nodded, acknowledging her words. "After he died, things changed. My mother, she couldn't handle it. She remarried, a man who wasn't kind to me, or her." He fell silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a dark, simmering anger. Delilah sensed a deep wound there, a pain that still lingered. "I left home when I was 16, he continued, his voice flat, emotionless. "Joined a cattle drive, headed north, worked my way up, learned the ropes, made a name for myself." He paused again, his gaze shifting, his eyes losing focus. "But I also made some mistakes. Bad choices. Got mixed up with the wrong crowd." He didn't elaborate, but Delilah could sense the weight of those unspoken words, the shadow of regret that hung over him. She thought of the rumors she'd heard, the talk of outlaws and violence. "What kind of mistakes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "The kind that leaves scars," he replied, his voice heavy with meaning. "The kind you can't outrun." Suddenly, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the stillness of the night. Delilah jumped, her hand instinctively reaching for her revolver. Silas was on his feet instantly, his body tense, his eyes scanning the darkness.
"Get down,"
he ordered, his voice sharp, urgent. Another shot rang out, closer this time, the bullet whizzing past them, embedding itself in the wooden wall of the house. Delilah dropped to the floor of the porch, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. Silas pushed her behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew his own revolver, a Colt Peacemaker, its steel gleaming in the moonlight. He moved with a swiftness and precision that belied his earlier calm, his eyes narrowed, his senses alert. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "Don't move." He stepped off the porch, disappearing into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Delilah remained crouched on the porch, her body trembling, her mind filled with fear and uncertainty. The echoes of gunfire still rang in her ears, a stark reminder of the danger that lurked in the night, the fragility of life on the frontier. She gripped the handle and listened. Chapter 5. Beneath the gaze of the desert moon. The silence that followed the gunshots was even more terrifying than the shots themselves. Delilah remained crouched on the porch, her heart pounding, her senses straining to pick up any sound, any movement. The vastness of the night seemed to press in on her, amplifying her fear, her vulnerability. The moon, a silent witness, cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape, transforming familiar shapes into menacing figures. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Delilah's mind raced, conjuring up images of Silas, lying wounded or dead in the darkness. She imagined the outlaws, whoever they were, closing in on the house, their intentions unknown, their faces hidden behind masks or bandanas. She fought back the rising panic, forcing herself to breathe deeply, to stay calm. She had to be strong, for herself, for Silas, for the memory of Thomas. She gripped her revolver, the cold steel a small comfort in the face of overwhelming fear. Finally, she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the house. She held her breath, her finger tightening on the trigger, her body tense, ready to defend herself. Silas emerged from the darkness, his face grim, his clothes covered in dust. He held his revolver at the ready, his eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. "They're gone," he said, his voice low and rough.
"For now."
Delilah let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her in a wave. She rose to her feet, her legs trembling, her body still buzzing with adrenaline.
"Who were they?"
she asked, her voice trembling.
"What did they want?"
Silas shook his head, his expression troubled. I don't know. I didn't get a good look at them. But they were riding fast, heading north. He holstered his revolver, his gaze meeting hers. Are you all right? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Delilah nodded, forcing a smile.
I'm fine.
Just shaken. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, a gesture of comfort, of reassurance. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. You're safe now, he said, his voice soft, his eyes holding hers. I won't let anything happen to you. His words, his presence, his touch, calmed her fears, eased her anxiety. She felt a sense of security, a sense of trust, that she hadn't expected to feel with this stranger, this man with a shadowed past. They stood there for a moment, beneath the gaze of the desert moon, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. The air crackled with a strange energy, a mixture of fear, relief, and something else, something deeper, something that stirred a long-dormant ember within her. We should go inside, Silas said, breaking the spell. It's not safe out here. Delilah nodded, reluctantly breaking away from his gaze. They went inside, the house feeling like a sanctuary, a refuge from the dangers of the night. Delilah lit a lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the bullet hole in the wall, a stark reminder of the violence that had just occurred. I don't understand, Delilah said, her voice troubled. Why would they attack us? What did they want? Silas paced the room, his brow furrowed in thought. It could be a lot of things. Robbery. A warning. Or something else. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. There's been talk of a gang operating in the area. The Blackwood Boys. They're ruthless, known for their brutality. Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard the rumors, the whispers of fear that circulated through the town. She dismissed them as idle gossip, but now, confronted with the reality of the attack, she realized the danger was real. Do you think it was them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas shrugged, his expression grim. It's possible. They're known to target isolated ranches. And they're not afraid to kill. Delilah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She'd fought so hard to keep Whispering Pines, to preserve Thomas's dream, but now, faced with this new threat, she felt her hope dwindling. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice filled with desperation. Silas stopped pacing, his gaze locking with hers. We're going to fight, he said, his voice firm, resolute. We're going to protect this ranch. And we're going to survive. His words, his determination, ignited a spark of hope within her, a flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. She looked at him, at his strong, determined face, at his dark, intense eyes, and she felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection. We'll do it together, she said, her voice gaining strength. She met his gaze, a silent promise passing between them, a bond forged in the crucible of danger, beneath the watchful gaze of the desert moon. The fear remained, but so did hope. Chapter 6. The unspoken promises of outlaws. The days that followed the attack were filled with a tense, uneasy calm. Delilah and Silas worked tirelessly, fortifying the ranch, preparing for the possibility of another assault. They repaired fences, strengthened gates, and established a watch system, taking turns keeping vigil throughout the night. The shared danger, the constant threat, drew them closer, forging a bond of unspoken trust and reliance. Delilah found herself increasingly drawn to Silas, to his quiet strength, his competence, his unwavering determination. She observed him closely, watching the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her. She saw the scars on his body, glimpses of a violent past, but she also saw the gentleness in his eyes, the kindness in his touch. She learned more about him, fragments of his story revealed in casual conversations, in shared moments of quiet contemplation. He'd been a lawman, once a Texas Ranger, riding the vast plains, upholding justice, fighting for what he believed in. But something had happened, something that had changed him, something that had driven him to leave that life behind. What happened? Delilah asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Why did you leave the Rangers? Silas hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. He took a deep breath, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. It's a long story, he said, his voice low and rough. A story I'm not proud of. I have time, Delilah said, her voice soft, encouraging. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the genuine curiosity, the empathy, the lack of judgment. He saw a woman who had known her own share of hardship, a woman who understood the weight of the past. I was tracking a gang of outlaws, he began, his voice barely a whisper. The very same Blackwood boys, as a matter of a fact. They'd robbed a bank, killed several innocent people. I was determined to bring them to justice. He paused, his voice choked with emotion. I tracked them for weeks, across miles of unforgiving terrain. I finally caught up with them, cornered them in a canyon. He closed his eyes, reliving the memory, the horror of it all. There was a shootout, a bloodbath. I killed several of them, but they got my partner, my best friend. Delilah felt a pang of sympathy for him, understanding the pain of losing someone close, the guilt and regret that could haunt a person for a lifetime. I'm sorry, Silas, she said, her voice sincere. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. I blamed myself, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I should have been faster, smarter, stronger. I should have saved him. He fell silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a dark, simmering anger. After that, I lost my way. I started drinking, gambling, getting into fights. I became the very thing I'd sworn to fight against. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. I'm not that man anymore, Delilah, he said, his voice firm. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better. Delilah believed him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse in his voice. She saw a man haunted by his past, but determined to redeem himself, to find a new purpose, a new beginning. I know you are, she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. Her fingers grazed his skin, sending a shiver through her. He covered her hand with his touch warm and strong. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. It felt like a promise. A horse neighed loudly in the distance, startling them out of the moment. Silas quickly rose to his feet. I'd better check the perimeter, he said, his voice back to the low tone, but his eyes lingered. Delilah nodded and watched him disappear into the growing dark. This time, the fear that she felt for his safety, for their safety, was mixed with something else. Something that felt a lot like hope, and a lot like the beginning of something forbidden. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past, Wounds of the Heart. The following days were a blur of activity. Delilah and Silas continued to work on the ranch, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and preparing for the inevitable return of the Blackwood boys. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their communication often unspoken, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of shared labor and impending danger. One afternoon, while they were mending a broken fence line, Delilah noticed a long, jagged scar on Silas's back, a pale, white line against his tan skin. It was a reminder of his past, of the violence he'd endured, of the secrets he carried. That's quite a scar, Delilah said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with concern. Silas glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. A souvenir, he said, his voice dry. From a knife fight. A long time ago. He didn't elaborate, and Delilah didn't press him. She understood the need for privacy, the reluctance to revisit painful memories. But she couldn't help but wonder about the story behind the scar, about the man he'd been, about the battles he'd fought. As they continued to work, Delilah found herself stealing glances at Silas, observing the way he moved, the way he handled the tools, the way he interacted with the animals. She saw the strength in his hands, the gentleness in his touch, the quiet confidence that emanated from him. She also saw the sadness in his eyes, the shadows of the past that still haunted him. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a vast expanse of stars. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, a shared understanding that transcended words. "You never talk about Thomas," Silas said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, hesitant, as if he were treading on sacred ground. Delilah looked at him, surprised by his question. She hadn't expected him to ask about her late husband, to delve into her own past. "There's not much to tell," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He was a good man, a hard worker. He loved this ranch. He loved me." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the horizon, her eyes filling with tears. "He died too young. A fever took him. Quick and brutal." She felt a lump in her throat, a familiar ache in her chest. She hadn't spoken about Thomas to anyone in a long time, not in this way, not with this level of vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Delilah," Silas said, his voice sincere, his eyes filled with empathy. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." She nodded, acknowledging his words, appreciating his understanding. "It changes you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It leaves a hole in your heart that never truly heals." "It does," Silas agreed, his voice heavy with meaning. "But it doesn't mean you can't love again. It doesn't mean you can't find happiness again." His words, his gaze, his presence, offered her a comfort, a solace, that she hadn't expected. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in shared loss, in shared pain. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the compassion in his eyes, the understanding, the hint of something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever love again." He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and strong. His fingers intertwined with hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "You don't have to be ready," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Just don't close yourself off. Don't let the past define you. Don't let fear control you." His thumb gently brushed the back of her hand, a small motion, but filled with a tenderness that was both terrifying and intoxicating. "There's still life left to live, Delilah. And maybe it's worth fighting for." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a question, a hope, a silent plea. Delilah's breath caught. The scars of her past, the wounds of her heart, felt suddenly, painfully, raw. But beneath that pain a flicker. A tiny spark of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Chapter 8. A dance with danger in the saloon. A week passed, a week of relentless work and simmering tension. Delilah and Silas had fallen into a rhythm, a partnership forged in necessity and strengthened by a growing, unspoken attraction. They needed supplies that couldn't wait. Delilah decided a trip to town was unavoidable. "We're running low on everything," Delilah said, her voice tight with concern. "Flour, sugar, coffee, and ammunition." Silas nodded, his expression grim. "I know. We can't put it off any longer. But it's risky. The Blackwood boys might be watching the town." "I know," Delilah said, her hand instinctively moving to the revolver at her hip. "But we have no choice. We'll go in early, get what we need, and get out fast." They set off before dawn, riding their horses side by side, the air crisp and cool, the sky a pale canvas gradually brightening with the approaching sunrise. They rode in silence, their senses alert, their eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. The town of Whispering Pines was small and dusty, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled together in the vastness of the desert. The main street was lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a sheriff's office, all weathered and worn, bearing the scars of time and hardship. They arrived as the town was just beginning to stir, the saloon doors still closed, the streets mostly empty. They tied their horses to a hitching post outside the general store, their movements cautious, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Inside the store, Delilah quickly gathered the supplies they needed, her movements efficient, her mind focused on the task at hand. Silas stood guard, his hand never far from his revolver, his eyes watching the street, alert for any sign of trouble. As Delilah was paying for the goods, the saloon doors swung open, and a group of men spilled out onto the street. They were rough-looking characters, their clothes dusty and worn, their faces unshaven, their eyes hardened by a life of violence. Delilah recognized them instantly, the Blackwood boys. Her heart leaped into her throat, her blood turning to ice. She glanced at Silas, her eyes wide with fear. He met her gaze, his expression grim, his hand moving to his revolver. The leader of the gang, a tall, menacing man with a cruel scar across his face, spotted Delilah and Silas. He grinned, a chilling, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what we have here. The widow Tate and her new hired hand. He stepped towards them, his gang flanking him, their hands hovering near their weapons. The air crackled with tension, the threat of violence palpable. We've been looking for you, the outlaw leader said, his eyes fixed on Delilah. We have some unfinished business. Delilah stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. She wouldn't show fear, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Get out of our way, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. We don't want any trouble. The outlaw leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Trouble is what we do best, widow. And you're knee-deep in it now. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Delilah and the outlaws. His body was tense, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Leave her alone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This doesn't concern you. The outlaw leader's grin widened. Oh, it concerns me all right. You see, we have a score to settle with the widow. And we always collect our debts. He nodded to his men, and they began to circle Delilah and Silas, their movements slow and deliberate, like wolves closing in on their prey. The tension in the air thickened, the threat of violence escalating. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed, Silas said, his voice calm, but his eyes filled with a steely determination. Just let us pass. The outlaw leader shook his head. Not a chance. You see, we've heard about you, Silas Hollis. The ex-ranger. The man with a price on his head. He paused, his grin widening. It seems we've stumbled upon a double prize. The widow and the outlaw. Delilah's heart sank. She'd known Silas had a past, but she hadn't realized he was a wanted man. The danger had just multiplied. She looked at him, questioning, her eyes meeting his, seeking answers. His face, usually so guarded, had a tightness. It was an admission. The outlaw leader drew his revolver, the steel gleaming in the morning sun. Time to dance, Ranger, he said, his voice dripping with malice. The street was silent. The showdown was inevitable. The dance with danger had begun. Chapter 9. The Sheriff's Warning, a Lover's Plea. The moment stretched, taut and silent. The only sound the faint creak of leather and the distant caw of a crow. Delilah's hand tightened on her own revolver, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She was trapped, surrounded by outlaws, facing a showdown she hadn't anticipated, a fight she wasn't sure she could win. Silas stood his ground, his body tense, his eyes locked on the outlaw leader, his hand hovering over his revolver. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his movements betraying years of experience, years of facing down danger, years of fighting for his life. Before anyone could draw, a voice boomed from across the street. Hold it right there, Blackwood. Sheriff Bartlett emerged from his office, his shotgun leveled at the outlaws, his face grim, his eyes filled with a weary determination. He was an older man, his hair graying, his face lined with the burdens of his office, but his posture was firm, his grip on the shotgun unwavering. The outlaw leader, Blackwood, turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, his cruel smile fading. He hadn't expected the sheriff's intervention, hadn't anticipated any resistance. Well, Well, Blackwood drawled, his voice still laced with sarcasm, but his bravado slightly diminished. Look who decided to join the party. Sheriff Bartlett. To what do we owe this displeasure? You know damn well what, Blackwood, Bartlett said, his voice hard, his shotgun steady. You're causing trouble in my town, harassing my citizens, and I won't tolerate it. We were just having a friendly conversation, Sheriff, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with mock innocence. Weren't we, widow? Delilah glared at him, her silence a defiant answer. Leave them alone, Blackwood, Bartlett said, his voice warning.
Get out of my town.
And don't come back. Blackwood hesitated, his eyes flickering between the sheriff's shotgun and Silas's unwavering gaze. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. He'd pushed his luck too far. All right, Sheriff, Blackwood said, his voice grudgingly compliant. We'll be on our way. But this ain't over. We'll be back. He nodded to his men, and they slowly backed away, their hands still hovering near their weapons. They mounted their horses and rode out of town, their departure a temporary reprieve, a postponement of the inevitable confrontation. Sheriff Bartlett lowered his shotgun, his shoulders slumping with relief. He turned to Delilah and Silas, his face etched with concern. You two all right? He asked, his voice gruff but kind. We're fine, Sheriff, Delilah said, her voice still trembling slightly.
Thank you.
You are lucky, Bartlett said, his gaze fixed on Silas. Blackwood is a dangerous man. He has a reputation for cruelty and violence. He paused, his eyes narrowing. And you, Silas Hollis, I know who you are. I know about your past. I know there's a price on your head. Silas met the sheriff's gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't deny the accusation, didn't offer any excuses. I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff, Silas said, his voice low and steady. I'm just trying to help Mrs. Tate. I appreciate that, Bartlett said, his voice softening slightly. But you're putting yourself and her in danger. Blackwood won't forget this.
He'll be back.
And he'll bring more men. We'll be ready, Silas said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. Bartlett sighed, his shoulders slumping again. I can't protect you forever, he said, his voice weary. I'm just one man, against a whole gang of outlaws. He looked at Delilah, his eyes filled with concern. You should leave, Mrs. Tate. Get out of Whispering Pines. Go somewhere safe. Before it's too late. Delilah shook her head, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not running, she said, her voice strong. This is my home. I won't be driven away by outlaws. Bartlett looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and pity. He knew he couldn't change her mind, couldn't persuade her to abandon her ranch. All right, he said, his voice resigned. But be careful. Both of you. And watch your backs. He turned and walked back to his office, leaving Delilah and Silas standing alone in the street, the weight of his warning hanging heavy in the air. They gathered their supplies and loaded them onto their horses, their movements silent, their minds preoccupied with the sheriff's words, with the looming threat of Blackwood's return. As they rode back to Whispering Pines, the silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, with fear, with uncertainty, with a growing sense of dread. He's right, Delilah said, breaking the silence. You should leave. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to risk your life for me. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and determination. I'm not leaving you, Delilah, he said, his voice firm. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. But it's too dangerous, Delilah pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. I can't ask you to do this. I can't ask you to sacrifice your life for me. It's my choice, Delilah. It was before the sheriff, and it is now. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and strong. His fingers intertwined with hers, a silent vow, a lover's plea. I'm not afraid of Blackwood. I'm not afraid of dying. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing you. The horses kept a slow and steady pace as they rode. The sun beat down, and the only sound was their breathing and the soft thud of hooves. Chapter 10. Broken Oaths and Hidden Truths. The return to Whispering Pines was heavy with a silence that neither Delilah nor Silas seemed willing to break. The sheriff's warning, Silas's declaration, and the near-deadly encounter with Blackwood hung in the air between them, a complex web of danger, loyalty, and unspoken desires. Once back at the ranch, they unloaded the supplies, their movements mechanical, their minds preoccupied. Delilah found herself stealing glances at Silas, her heart filled with a conflicting mixture of gratitude, fear, and a growing affection that she couldn't deny, couldn't ignore. As they were putting away the supplies in the pantry, Delilah couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Silas," she said, her voice hesitant, "what did Blackwood mean? About a price on your head?" Silas paused, his back to her, his shoulders tense. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. He turned slowly, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "It's true," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm a wanted man. There's a bounty on my head. For desertion. And other things." Delilah's heart sank. She'd known he had a past, a dark and troubled past, but she hadn't realized the extent of it. She'd trusted him, relied on him, and now she felt a flicker of doubt, a seed of fear, growing in her heart. "What other things?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He walked to the window, staring out at the vast, unforgiving landscape, his silhouette framed against the fading light. "After I left the Rangers," he began, his voice choked with emotion, I fell in with the wrong crowd. I did things I'm not proud of. Things I can never take back." He turned to face her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I robbed trains, stagecoaches, even a bank. I justified it, told myself I was taking from the rich, giving to the poor. But it was a lie. I was just lost. Angry. Hurting." Delilah felt a wave of disappointment, a sense of betrayal. She'd seen the good in him, the kindness, the gentleness, but now she was confronted with the darkness, the violence, the criminality of his past. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you keep this from me?" "I was afraid," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Afraid you'd judge me. Afraid you'd reject me. Afraid you'd see me for the man I was, not the man I'm trying to be." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her, but she flinched, pulling away from his touch. The gesture stung him, a visible sign of the widening chasm between them. "I trusted you," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I let you into my home, into my life."
"And you lied to me."
"I never lied to you, Delilah," he said, his voice pleading. "I just didn't tell you the whole truth. I omitted things. There's a difference." "It's the same thing," she said, her voice rising in anger. "You deceived me. You betrayed my trust." He shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "I was trying to protect you, Delilah. From my past. From the danger it could bring. I didn't want you to get caught up in my mess." "You already did," she said, her voice bitter. "By coming here, by staying here, you put me in danger. You made me a target." He stepped closer again, his hand reaching out to her, his eyes pleading. "I know," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "And I'm sorry. I'll leave. I'll go away. I'll disappear. Just please, don't hate me." Delilah looked at him, her heart torn. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse, the desperation. She saw the man he was trying to be, the man he could be, but she also saw the shadow of his past, the darkness that still lingered. She didn't know what to do, what to believe. Her trust had been broken, her faith shattered. She felt lost, confused, betrayed. The weight felt unbearable. I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I need space. I need to think." Silas nodded, his shoulders slumping with defeat. He understood, accepted her need for distance, her need for time to process the truth, to reconcile the conflicting emotions that were tearing her apart. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements slow, his head bowed. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe, his back to her. I swear, Delilah, I will protect you. Blackwood or no Blackwood. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. I may be a wanted man. I might even deserve to be. But one thing I will never betray is my word to you. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Delilah alone with her thoughts, her doubts, her fears, and the shattered remnants of her trust. The truth had been revealed, but the path forward was shrouded in darkness, uncertainty, and the haunting echoes of broken oaths. Chapter 11. Riding through the storm of betrayal. The night was long and restless. Delilah tossed and turned, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She replayed Silas's confession, his words echoing in her ears, his pain etched on her heart. She felt betrayed, hurt, confused, but also a lingering sense of empathy, a flicker of understanding for the man he had been, the man he was trying to become. She rose before dawn, her body aching, her mind weary. She went outside, the air crisp and cool, the sky still dark, the stars beginning to fade with the approaching sunrise. She needed to clear her head, to find some semblance of peace, some clarity in the midst of the turmoil. She saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, and rode out into the vastness of the desert. The silence of the open landscape soothed her frayed nerves, the rhythmic beat of Belle's hooves a calming counterpoint to the chaos in her mind. As she rode, she thought about Thomas, about their life together, about the dreams they had shared. She thought about the hardships they had faced, the challenges they had overcome, the love that had bound them together. She thought about the loneliness she had endured since his death, the void he had left to her life, the burden she had carried alone. She thought about Silas, about his arrival, about the hope he had ignited within her, the sense of connection she had felt, the unspoken attraction that had blossomed between them. She thought about his past, his crimes, his betrayal, but also about his remorse, his determination to change, his promise to protect her. She rode for hours, the sun rising higher in the sky, the landscape transforming from the soft hues of dawn to the harsh glare of midday. She rode until Belle was lathered in sweat, until her own body was exhausted, until her mind was numb. As she turned back towards Whispering Pines, she saw a figure in the distance, riding towards her. Her heart leaped into her throat, her hand instinctively moving to her revolver. She squinted, her eyes straining to identify the rider. It was Silas. He rode towards her, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. He reined in his horse beside hers, his gaze searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with worry.
I saw you ride out.
I was worried. Delilah looked at him, her emotions a tangled mess. She felt a surge of anger, of resentment, but also a flicker of relief, a spark of something she couldn't quite define. "I needed to think," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "I understand," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with empathy. They rode in silence for a while, the tension between them palpable. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with unresolved conflict, with a lingering attraction that neither of them could deny. "I'm not going anywhere, Delilah," Silas said, breaking the silence. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I meant what I said. I'll protect you. I'll stay by your side. No matter what." His words, his sincerity, his unwavering determination touched her heart, chipping away at the wall of anger and resentment she had built around herself.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you risk your life for me? After everything you've done, after everything you've told me?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and regret. "Because I care about you, Delilah," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible. More than I should." His words, his confession, took her breath away. She had suspected his feelings, had sensed the growing attraction between them, but to hear him say it, to hear him admit his vulnerability, was both exhilarating and terrifying. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice trembling. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and strong. His fingers intertwined with hers, a silent connection, a bond that transcended their past, their present, their uncertain future. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice soft.
Just let me stay.
"Let me prove myself to you. Let me earn back your trust." As they rode, the sky above them darkened, the clouds gathering, the wind picking up. A storm was brewing, a reflection of the turmoil within them, the uncertainty that lay ahead. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, splattering on the dusty ground. "We should head back," Delilah said, her voice urgent. "We don't want to get caught in the storm." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They turned their horses and rode towards Whispering Pines, the rain falling harder now, the wind whipping around them, the thunder rumbling in the distance. They rode through the storm, side by side, their bodies soaked, their faces grim, their hearts pounding. They rode through the storm of betrayal, of doubt, of fear, towards an uncertain future, a future that held both danger and the fragile promise of something more. Chapter 12. The Cost of Freedom, the Weight of Love. The storm raged throughout the night, mirroring the tempest in Delilah's heart. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, and the thunder shook the small house to its foundations. Delilah and Silas huddled inside, the silence between them punctuated by the fury of the elements. They had barely spoken since their ride back from the desert, the weight of their unspoken emotions, their unresolved conflict, hanging heavy in the air. Delilah had retreated into herself, her mind a whirlwind of doubt, fear, and a reluctant, undeniable attraction to the man who had betrayed her trust. Silas had respected her silence, giving her the space she needed, but his presence was a constant reminder of the dilemma she faced, the choice she had to make. He stayed busy, tending to the horses, checking the fences, making sure the ranch was secure against the storm. As the night wore on, the storm began to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a drizzle. Delilah sat by the window, watching the lightning flash across the sky, illuminating the rain-soaked landscape. Silas came and stood beside her, his presence a comforting warmth in the chilly room. He didn't speak, didn't intrude on her thoughts, but his silent support was a balm to her frayed nerves. "It's letting up," he said, his voice low and soft, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Delilah nodded, her eyes following his gaze. The clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of starry sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of calm, a sense of renewal. "I've been thinking," Delilah said, her voice barely a whisper, "about what you said.
About us."
Silas turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the uncertainty, the vulnerability, but also a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something more. "And?" he asked, his voice hesitant, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again," she said, her voice trembling. "But I also know that I can't deny the way I feel about you." Her words, her admission, sent a surge of relief, of joy, through him. He had expected rejection, condemnation, but he had dared to hope for something more. "I understand," he said, his voice sincere. "I know I have a lot to prove, but I'll do whatever it takes. I'll earn your trust, Delilah. I swear it." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his touch gentle, tentative. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth of his hand against her skin. "I'm scared, Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Scared of getting hurt again. Scared of losing everything." "I know," he said, his voice soothing. "But you're not alone. We'll face it together. Whatever comes." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle against hers. It was a kiss of comfort, of reassurance, of unspoken promises. It was a kiss that acknowledged the pain of the past, the uncertainty of the future, but also the undeniable connection between them, the spark of hope that had survived the storm. Delilah responded to his kiss, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss of surrender, of acceptance, of a fragile, tentative trust. It was a kiss that said more than words ever could. The next morning, as they were preparing breakfast, A group of riders approached the ranch. Delilah's heart leaped into her throat, her hand instinctively moving to her revolver. "It's them," she said, her voice filled with dread. "It's Blackwood." Silas looked out the window, his face grim, his eyes narrowed. He counted 5 riders, all heavily armed, their faces hardened, their intentions clear. "Stay inside," he said, his voice firm. "Lock the door. I'll handle this." "No," Delilah said, her voice defiant. "We'll face them together."
Like you said.
She grabbed her own revolver, her hand steady, her eyes filled with a steely determination. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't hide. She would stand by Silas's side, fight for her home, for her life, for the fragile hope of a future together. They stepped outside, facing the approaching riders, their revolvers drawn, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding. The cost of freedom, the weight of love, was about to be measured in the unforgiving currency of the frontier: blood, sweat, and tears. They stood shoulder to shoulder. Chapter 13. Whispers of Rebellion in the Wind. Blackwood and his men reined in their horses a short distance from the house, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of malice and anticipation. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind. "Well, Blackwood drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like the lovebirds are ready to face the music." Delilah stood tall, her revolver aimed at Blackwood, her hand steady, her eyes blazing with defiance. She wouldn't be intimidated, wouldn't back down, wouldn't let fear control her. "Get off my property, Blackwood," she said, her voice strong and clear. "You're not welcome here." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Your property, widow? I think not. This land belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it. And that's us." Silas stepped forward, his body shielding Delilah, his revolver aimed at Blackwood, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Blackwood's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "That's what I was hoping you'd say, Ranger. I've been looking forward to this." He nodded to his men, and they spread out, forming a semicircle around Delilah and Silas, their weapons drawn, their intentions clear. The odds were stacked against them, 5-2, but Delilah and Silas stood their ground, their determination unwavering. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed," Silas said, his voice calm but firm. "Just leave, and we'll forget this ever happened." Blackwood shook his head, his cruel smile unwavering. "Not a chance, Ranger. We have a score to settle, and we always collect our debts." He paused, his gaze shifting to Delilah. "Besides, the widow here has something I want, something that belongs to me." Delilah's heart sank. She knew what he was talking about. The ranch, Whispering Pines, the land that had been in her family for generations, the land that Thomas had loved, the land she was determined to protect. "This ranch is mine, Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with defiance. "And you'll never have it." Blackwood laughed again, his eyes mocking. "We'll see about that, widow. We'll see." He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire, the bullets whizzing past Delilah and Silas, kicking up dust, splintering wood. Delilah and Silas returned fire, their shots precise and deadly, their movements synchronized, their years of experience evident. They fought back to back, protecting each other, their bodies moving in a deadly dance of survival. One of Blackwood's men fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a thud. Another cried out in pain, clutching his arm, his revolver falling to the dirt. But the outlaws kept coming, their numbers overwhelming, their attacks relentless. Delilah felt a bullet graze her arm, a searing pain that made her flinch, but she kept firing, her determination fueled by adrenaline and a fierce will to survive. Silas took a bullet to the shoulder, his body jerking with the impact, but he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, his face contorted with pain, but he kept fighting, his revolver blazing, his aim true. The battle raged, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded, the smell of gunpowder and blood. Delilah and Silas fought with a courage and determination that belied their desperate situation, their love for each other, their commitment to protecting their home, fueling their every move. As the battle reached its climax, Delilah saw Blackwood aiming his revolver at Silas, his finger tightening on the trigger. She screamed, a desperate cry of warning, and threw herself in front of Silas, shielding him with her body. The shot rang out, the bullet meant for Silas finding its mark in Delilah's shoulder. She cried out in pain, her body staggering, her revolver slipping from her grasp. Silas caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her, his face filled with horror and anguish. He lowered her gently to the ground, his hands pressing against her wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Delilah," he cried, his voice choked with emotion.
No, please don't leave me.
Delilah looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with pain, but also with love. She reached out and touched his cheek, her hand trembling. "I love you, Silas," she whispered, her voice weak, her breath shallow. Her eyes closed, her body went limp, her hand falling from his cheek. The sounds of battle faded into a distant hum. Silas held her close, his tears falling onto her face, his heart shattering into a million pieces. But amidst the sounds of gunfire, a new sound pierced the air. A chorus of shouts, whoops, the thundering of many hooves. Chapter 14. A haven in the heart of the wilderness. Silas cradled Delilah's body, his grief overwhelming, his rage a burning fire in his gut. He had failed her. He had promised to protect her, and he had failed. He looked up at Blackwood, who was smirking, his revolver still smoking, his eyes filled with a triumphant, cruel satisfaction. Before Silas could act, before his rage could consume him, the sound of approaching riders filled the air, a thunderous roar that drowned out the remaining gunfire. A group of men, heavily armed and riding hard, swept into the ranch, their faces grim, their intentions clear. It was Sheriff Bartlett, leading a posse of townsfolk, armed with rifles, shotguns, and whatever weapons they could find. They had heard the gunfire, seen the smoke, and had come to help. Blackwood and his remaining men, caught off guard and outnumbered, were quickly overwhelmed. The battle was short and brutal, the townsfolk fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and a desire to protect their own. Blackwood was shot dead by Sheriff Bartlett, his body falling to the ground with a thud, his cruel smile finally erased. The remaining outlaws were either killed or captured, their reign of terror brought to an end. Silas, oblivious to the chaos around him, remained kneeling beside Delilah, his hands still pressing against her wound, his tears falling onto her pale face. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a gentle touch that broke through his grief. It was Sheriff Bartlett, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with compassion. "Silas," he said, his voice soft. "Let me see her." Silas reluctantly moved aside, allowing the sheriff to examine Delilah. Bartlett felt for a pulse, his fingers pressing against her neck. He looked up at Silas, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "She's alive," he said, his voice hushed. "But she's lost a lot of blood. We need to get her to Doc Miller."
Now.
They carefully lifted Delilah onto a makeshift stretcher, fashioned from blankets and wooden planks. They carried her to the sheriff's wagon and rode as fast as they could to the town, to the doctor's office. Doc Miller, a grizzled old man with steady hands and a kind heart, worked tirelessly to save Delilah's life. He cleaned and bandaged her wound, stopping the bleeding, administering whatever medicine he had available. Silas waited outside the operating room, his heart pounding, his mind racing, his body exhausted but his spirit unwilling to give up hope. He paced the floor, praying, pleading, bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening. Hours passed, the longest hours of Silas's life. Finally, Doc Miller emerged from the operating room, his face weary, his clothes stained with blood. He looked at Silas, his expression unreadable. "How is she?" Silas asked, his voice choked with emotion, his heart in his throat. She's stable, Doc Miller said, his voice tired but firm. The bullet passed clean through. She's lost a lot of blood, but she's strong. She'll pull through. Relief washed over Silas, a wave of emotion so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He sagged against the wall, his body trembling, his tears flowing freely. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Doc Miller nodded. "But just for a few minutes."
She needs to rest.
Silas entered the room, his heart aching with love and gratitude. Delilah lay in bed, her face pale, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked fragile, vulnerable, but also beautiful. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his touch gentle, reverent. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering on her skin. "I love you, Delilah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll always love you. I'll never leave you." He stayed with her for hours, watching over her, praying for her recovery, his love a silent vigil in the quiet room. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow through the window, Delilah's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Silas, her gaze weak, but filled with recognition. She smiled, a faint, fragile smile that lit up her face. "Silas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here, Delilah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere."
He knew then.
No matter what the future held, this small, dusty town, this haven in the heart of the wilderness, was where he belonged. With her. Chapter 15. The ghost of a promise haunting the plains. Delilah's recovery was slow but steady. Doc Miller had done his best, but the wound had taken its toll. She was weak, her energy depleted, her body slowly mending. Silas never left her side, tending to her needs, watching over her, his love a constant presence, a silent reassurance. He brought her meals, read to her, told her stories, anything to distract her from the pain, to keep her spirits up. He slept in a chair beside her bed, his hand always within reach, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of her recovery. As Delilah regained her strength, she began to ask questions about the attack, about Blackwood, about the future. Silas answered her questions honestly, but he avoided talking about his own past, about the price on his head, about the danger that still lingered. "What will happen now?" Delilah asked him one afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the doctor's house, enjoying the warm sunshine. "Will they come after you? The law, I mean?" Silas hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He knew he couldn't hide the truth from her forever, but he dreaded the thought of losing her, of seeing the trust in her eyes replaced by fear and disappointment. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and troubled. "Sheriff Bartlett knows who I am. He could arrest me, send me back to Texas to face trial. But he helped us," Delilah said, her voice filled with confusion. "He saved our lives. Why would he do that if he intended to arrest you?" Silas shrugged, his expression grim. "He's a good man, Bartlett. He believes in justice, but he also believes in second chances. He said he'd give me some time to prove myself, to show him I've changed." "And have you?" Delilah asked, her eyes searching his, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Silas met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I have, Delilah," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not the man I was. I'm done running. I'm done with the violence, the lies, the regret. I want a new life. With you." His words, his honesty, his vulnerability, touched her heart. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the determination to change, the love that shone through his every word, his every gesture. "I believe you, Silas," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his. Her fingers intertwined with his, a silent affirmation, a renewal of their bond. But the ghost of his past still haunted them, a shadow that lingered in the corners of their lives, a threat that could resurface at any moment. Silas knew that he couldn't outrun his past forever, that sooner or later, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, a lone rider approached the house. Silas's heart leaped into his throat, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. He recognized the rider, a U.S. Marshal, a man he had known from his days as a Texas Ranger. The Marshal, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and steely eyes, reined in his horse in front of the porch. He looked at Silas, his expression unreadable. "Silas Hollis," he said, his voice cold and formal. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Delilah gasped, her eyes widening in fear. She looked at Silas, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. Silas stood tall, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and defiance. He had expected this, had known this day would come. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. He turned to Delilah, his eyes filled with love and regret. "I'm sorry, Delilah," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of love, of loss, of a future that might never be. It was a goodbye kiss. A kiss filled with the unspoken promise to return, if he could. Chapter 16. Blood on the sand, tears in the rain. Delilah watched in stunned silence as the marshal handcuffed Silas, his movements efficient and impersonal. The cold steel of the cuffs seemed to symbolize the end of her hopes, the shattering of her dreams, the severing of the fragile bond she had forged with this complex, troubled man. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, her eyes filling with tears. "This can't be happening." Silas turned to her, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the circumstances, the impending separation. "Delilah," he said, his voice rough with emotion.
"It'll be all right.
I'll find a way. I'll come back to you. I promise." His words, his promise, offered a glimmer of hope, a fragile lifeline in the sea of despair that threatened to engulf her. But she knew the odds were stacked against him, the path ahead fraught with danger and uncertainty. The marshal mounted his horse, pulling Silas up behind him. They rode away, disappearing into the vastness of the desert, leaving Delilah standing alone on the porch, her heart breaking, her tears flowing freely. She watched until they were out of sight, until the dust had settled, until the silence of the evening enveloped her. She felt numb, empty, lost. The world seemed to have lost its color, its vibrancy, its meaning. Sheriff Bartlett arrived shortly after, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with compassion. He had seen the marshal ride out with Silas, had known what had transpired. "I'm sorry, Delilah," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. "I tried to stop him. I told him Silas had changed, that he deserved a second chance. But he had a warrant. There was nothing I could do." Delilah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "He promised," she said, her voice trembling. "He promised he would stay. He promised he would protect me." "I know," Bartlett said, his voice soothing. "And I believe he meant it. But sometimes promises aren't enough. Sometimes the past catches up with you, no matter how hard you try to outrun it." He paused, his gaze shifting, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "I know this is hard, Delilah. But you're strong. You'll get through this. You've survived worse." Delilah shook her head, her tears flowing anew. "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I love him, Sheriff. I don't want to lose him." Bartlett put his arm around her, offering a comforting embrace, a silent expression of support. He knew the pain of loss, the ache of a broken heart. He knew that words were often inadequate, that sometimes all you could offer was your presence, your silent understanding. They stood there for a long time, Delilah leaning against the sheriff, her body trembling, her tears soaking his shirt. The sun set, casting long shadows across the landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange, red, and purple. As darkness fell, a storm began to brew, the wind picking up, the clouds gathering, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping with Delilah, mirroring her grief, her despair, her loss. Delilah stood on the porch, the rain washing over her, cleansing her tears, cooling her fevered brow. She looked out at the vast, dark landscape, her heart aching, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't give up, couldn't succumb to despair. She had to be strong, for herself, for Silas, for the memory of Thomas. She had to fight, to persevere, to find a way to bring Silas back, to reclaim the future they had dreamed of, the love they had shared. She didn't know how, she didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to try. She had to find a way to navigate the treacherous path ahead, to overcome the obstacles, to challenge the forces that threatened to tear them apart. The blood on the sand, a reminder of the violence of the past. The tears in the rain, a testament to the pain of the present. But beneath the surface, a spark of hope remained, a flicker of determination, a stubborn refusal to surrender. She would fight. She would find a way. She would get Silas back. Because a promise whispered on a dusty frontier, under a sky full of stars, was worth fighting for. And she knew somewhere he was fighting too. Chapter 17. The Reckoning of Lost Souls. Delilah didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the storm rage, her mind replaying every moment she had shared with Silas, every word, every touch, every kiss. She clung to his promise, to the hope that he would return, but fear gnawed at her, whispering doubts, painting a bleak picture of the future. As dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool, the sky a vast expanse of pale blue. Delilah knew she couldn't stay idle, couldn't succumb to despair. She had to act, to do something, anything, to try to help Silas. She dressed quickly, her movements determined, her mind focused. She saddled Belle and rode to town, to the sheriff's office. She needed information, needed to know where Silas had been taken, what his chances were, what she could do to help. Sheriff Bartlett was surprised to see her, his face etched with concern. He knew how much Silas meant to her, how deeply she cared for him. "Delilah," he said, his voice soft. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." "I need your help, Sheriff," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely determination. "I need to know where they took Silas. I need to know what's going to happen to him." Bartlett hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He knew the truth was harsh, the odds stacked against Silas. He didn't want to give her false hope, but he also couldn't deny her the information she sought. "They took him to Fort Worth," he said, his voice low and troubled. "He'll be held there, pending trial, for desertion from the Rangers and for the other charges. The robberies." Delilah's heart sank. Fort Worth was a long way away, a place filled with hardened criminals, a place where justice was often swift and brutal. "What are his chances?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her fear palpable. Bartlett sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Not good, Delilah," he said, his voice honest, his eyes filled with compassion. "The evidence against him is strong. And the judge, he's known for being tough, unforgiving." Delilah felt a wave of despair wash over her, but she fought it back, refusing to give up hope. She had to be strong, for Silas, for herself. "I have to go to him," she said, her voice firm, her determination unwavering. "I have to see him. I have to help him." Bartlett looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew the journey would be long and arduous, the dangers real, the chances of success slim. "It's a long way, Delilah," he said, his voice warning. "And it's dangerous. You could get hurt, or worse." "I don't care," she said, her voice defiant. "I'm not afraid. I have to do this. For Silas." Bartlett saw the fire in her eyes, the unwavering determination, the love that fueled her every move. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, couldn't stop her from trying. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "I'll help you. I'll give you a map, supplies, and the name of a lawyer in Fort Worth. He's a good man, honest and fair. He might be able to help Silas." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But be careful, Delilah. Fort Worth is a rough town. And the law, it's not always just." Delilah nodded, her gratitude evident. She took the map, the supplies, and the lawyer's name, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She left the sheriff's office, her mind focused on the journey ahead, on the challenges she would face, on the man she loved, the man she was determined to save. The reckoning of lost souls was about to begin, a journey into the heart of darkness, a fight for justice, for redemption, for love. And the clock was ticking. Chapter 18. Facing the dawn after the longest night. The journey to Fort Worth was long and arduous. Delilah rode for days, across vast plains, through rugged mountains, and along dusty trails. She faced scorching heat, torrential rain, and the constant threat of danger from both wild animals and outlaws. She slept under the stars, ate meager meals, and pushed herself to her limits, her determination fueled by her love for Silas, her unwavering belief in his innocence, her desperate hope for a future together. She encountered other travelers along the way, some friendly, some hostile, but she kept to herself, her focus unwavering, her purpose clear. She avoided towns and settlements, fearing recognition, fearing delays, fearing anything that might hinder her progress. Finally, after weeks of relentless travel, she reached Fort Worth. The town was a sprawling, bustling hub of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of Whispering Pines. It was a place of law and order, but also of corruption and violence, a place where justice could be bought and sold, a place where the line between right and wrong was often blurred. Delilah found a small, discreet boarding house on the outskirts of town, a place where she could rest, gather her strength, and plan her next move. She contacted the lawyer Sheriff Bartlett had recommended, a man named Mr. Abernathy, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for honesty and integrity. She met with Mr. Abernathy in his office, a small, cluttered room filled with law books and legal documents. He listened to her story, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Mrs. Tate," he said, his voice measured and professional, "I'll be honest with you. The case against your friend is strong. The evidence is substantial, and the judge, he's not known for his leniency." Delilah's heart sank, but she refused to give up hope. "There must be something you can do," she said, her voice pleading. "He's a good man, Mr. Abernathy. He's changed. He deserves a second chance." Mr. Abernathy sighed, his gaze softening slightly. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the unwavering love, the fierce determination. He was moved by her loyalty, her commitment, her unwavering belief in Silas. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice more encouraging. "I'll review the evidence, interview witnesses, and build the best defense possible. But I can't make any promises. The odds are stacked against us." Delilah nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice sincere. "That's all I ask." She asked to see Silas. Mr. Abernathy arranged a visit, warning her that it would be brief, supervised, and that Silas's condition might be distressing. Delilah braced herself, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She was led to the jail, a grim, imposing building that housed the town's criminals, a place of darkness and despair. She was taken to a small, bare visiting room, separated from Silas by a thick iron bars. When Silas was brought in, Delilah's breath caught in her throat. He was thinner, paler, his clothes ragged, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. But when he saw her, his face lit up, his eyes shining with love and gratitude. "Delilah," he said, his voice hoarse, his hand reaching out to touch the bars that separated them. "You came." "Of course, I came," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her tears flowing freely. "I told you I would." They talked for a few precious minutes, their words hushed, their emotions raw. They spoke of their love, their hopes, their fears. Silas told her about the conditions in the jail, the harsh treatment, the despair that permeated the walls. "I'm scared, Delilah," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can survive this." "You will," she said, her voice firm, her determination unwavering. "I believe in you, Silas. And I'm not giving up. I'll fight for you." We'll get through this. Together. Their time was up all too soon. As the guard led Silas away, Delilah reached through the bars, her fingers brushing against his. I love you, Silas, she said, her voice filled with a fierce, unwavering love. I love you too, Delilah, he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. More than life itself. Delilah left the jail, her heart heavy but her resolve strengthened. She had seen Silas, had spoken to him, had reaffirmed her love, her commitment. She knew the battle ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to fight. She would face the dawn after the longest night, armed with love, hope, and an unwavering determination to bring Silas home. The fight for his life, for their future, was far from over. Chapter 19. A new beginning carved in stone. The weeks leading up to Silas's trial were a whirlwind of activity. Delilah worked tirelessly with Mr. Abernathy, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for the legal battle that lay ahead. She spent hours in the law library, poring over legal documents, researching precedents, and learning everything she could about the law, about the charges against Silas, about the judge who would preside over his fate. She discovered that the key witness against Silas was a former member of the Blackwood Gang, a man named Jedediah, who had turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. Jedediah's testimony was damning, painting Silas as a ruthless outlaw, a cold-blooded killer, a man who deserved to be punished to the full extent of the law. Delilah knew that Jedediah was lying, that he was motivated by revenge and a desire to save his own skin. But proving it would be difficult, almost impossible. Jedediah was a convincing liar, and the evidence against Silas, while circumstantial, was compelling. Mr. Abernathy worked diligently, filing motions, challenging the prosecution's evidence, and preparing a strong defense. He argued that Silas had acted in self-defense, that he had been a changed man since leaving the Rangers, that he had risked his own life to protect Delilah, to defend Whispering Pines from the Blackwood Gang. But the judge, a stern, unforgiving man named Judge Hawthorne, seemed unmoved by Mr. Abernathy's arguments. He was known for his harsh sentences, his unwavering adherence to the letter of the law, his lack of sympathy for outlaws and criminals. Delilah visited Silas in jail every day, bringing him news, offering him encouragement, and reaffirming her love, her unwavering support. She saw the toll the confinement was taking on him, the physical and emotional strain, the despair that threatened to consume him. Don't give up, Silas, she pleaded with him, her voice filled with emotion. We'll fight this. We'll win. I know we will. Silas tried to be strong for her, to maintain a facade of hope, but she saw the fear in his eyes, the doubt that gnawed at him. He knew the odds were stacked against him, the chances of acquittal slim. The day of the trial arrived, a day filled with tension, anticipation, and dread. The courtroom was packed, filled with spectators, reporters, and law enforcement officials. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of fear and justice. Delilah sat in the front row, her heart pounding, her hands clenched, her eyes fixed on Silas. He looked pale and drawn, but he met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and resignation. The trial began, a grueling process of testimony, cross-examination, and legal arguments. The prosecution presented its case, painting Silas as a dangerous outlaw, a menace to society. Jedediah took the stand, his testimony smooth and convincing, his lies flowing effortlessly from his lips. Mr. Abernathy cross-examined Jedediah relentlessly, exposing inconsistencies in his story, highlighting his motives for lying, but the damage had been done. The jury, a panel of 12 men and women, seemed swayed by Jedediah's testimony, their faces grim, their eyes filled with judgment. Delilah's heart sank. She saw the hope fading from Silas's eyes, the despair creeping into his soul. She knew that the verdict was likely to be guilty, the sentence harsh. As the trial neared its end, Delilah made a desperate decision. She couldn't stand by and watch Silas be condemned, couldn't let him be sent to prison, or worse, to the gallows. She stood up, her voice trembling but firm. interrupting the proceedings. "Your Honor," she said, her eyes fixed on the judge. "I have something to say. I have evidence that proves Silas Hollis is innocent." The courtroom erupted in chaos, the judge banging his gavel, the spectators murmuring, the lawyers objecting. Delilah stood her ground, her determination unwavering. "I know who the real leader of those robberies was, Your Honor. I know Silas was forced, and I know where to find proof." The judge, after much deliberation and overruling countless objections, agreed to let Delilah speak. She told of finding, in an old, locked box in Thomas's study, a series of letters. Letters from Caleb, her own brother. Letters outlining a plan, a conspiracy, to use Silas, to frame him, to take Whispering Pines by force. The courtroom was stunned into silence. The twist was unexpected. The betrayal, profound. Caleb, it turned out, had been secretly financing Blackwood, using Silas as a pawn in his own twisted game. The letters were presented as evidence, their authenticity verified. Caleb was arrested, his empire crumbling around him, his betrayal exposed. The charges against Silas were dropped. He was a free man. He walked out of the courtroom, blinking in the sunlight, a free man. Delilah ran to him, throwing her arms around him, her tears flowing freely. They embraced, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to their resilience, their unwavering commitment to each other. A new beginning, carved in the stone of the frontier, awaited them. A future, finally, free of shadows. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The aftermath of the trial was a blur of activity. Silas was released, his name cleared, his freedom restored. Caleb was arrested, his crimes exposed, his empire crumbling. The town of Whispering Pines rejoiced, celebrating the triumph of justice, the vindication of an innocent man. But for Delilah and Silas, the celebration was muted, overshadowed by the emotional toll of the ordeal, the lingering scars of betrayal and loss. They returned to Whispering Pines, to the ranch that had been the center of their struggle, the symbol of their love, their resilience, their shared dreams. The ranch was in disrepair, neglected and damaged during the conflict with Blackwood. But it was home, a place of sanctuary, a place where they could rebuild their lives, heal their wounds, and forge a new future together. They worked side by side, repairing fences, tending to the cattle, restoring the house to its former glory. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized, their communication often unspoken, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of shared hardship and unwavering love. As they worked, they began to talk, to share their feelings, to process the trauma they had endured. Silas spoke of his guilt, his regret, his fear of losing Delilah, his gratitude for her unwavering belief in him. "I don't deserve you, Delilah," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "After everything I've done, after everything I've put you through, you still stood by me. You saved me." Delilah looked at him, her eyes filled with love and compassion. "You deserve a second chance, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "We all do. And I believe in you. I always have." She spoke of her own fears, her doubts, her anger at Caleb, her grief over Thomas, her unwavering love for Silas. She confessed her vulnerability, her need for him, her desire for a future free of shadows, free of fear. "I was so scared of losing you," she said, her voice trembling. I thought I couldn't go on without you." Silas took her hand, his touch warm and strong. His fingers intertwined with hers, a silent vow, a promise of a future together. "You'll never lose me, Delilah," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here to stay. I'm not going anywhere. We'll face whatever comes, together." As the days turned into weeks, they began to heal, to rebuild, to rediscover the joy and peace that had been stolen from them. They found solace in each other's arms, in the quiet beauty of the landscape, in the simple routines of ranch life. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Silas took a small, velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a simple, silver ring, adorned with a small, sparkling turquoise stone. "Delilah," he said, his voice hesitant, his eyes filled with love and hope. "I know I'm not perfect. I know I have a past. But I love you more than anything in this world. Will you marry me?" Delilah's heart overflowed with emotion, her eyes filling with tears of joy. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion, unable to speak. Silas slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling. It was a perfect fit, a symbol of their enduring love, their unbreakable bond, their shared future. They embraced, their kiss long and passionate, a seal on their commitment, a promise of a lifetime together. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, red, and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to their final confrontation of hearts and horizons. They had faced betrayal, violence, and the harsh realities of frontier justice. They had overcome obstacles, defied the odds, and emerged stronger, their love tested and proven true. They stood on the porch of Whispering Pines, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with love, gratitude, and hope. The future stretched before them, a vast, open landscape filled with possibilities, with challenges, with the promise of a new beginning, a life built on trust, forgiveness, and an enduring, unwavering love. They had reached their final horizon together. And it was beautiful. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the growth of the ranch, and the deepening of Delilah and Silas's love. Whispering Pines thrived, a testament to their hard work, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to each other. They had children, a son and a daughter, who filled their lives with laughter, joy, and the boundless energy of youth. The children grew up surrounded by love, learning the values of honesty, integrity, and hard work, the lessons of the frontier etched into their very being. Silas never forgot his past, the mistakes he had made, the debts he had paid. He used his experiences to guide his children, to teach them the importance of making good choices, of standing up for what's right, of cherishing the precious gift of freedom. Delilah never forgot the pain of loss, the fear of betrayal, the strength she had found within herself. She used her experiences to empower her children, to teach them the importance of resilience, of courage, of never giving up on their dreams. They often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, reminiscing about their past, marveling at the journey they had taken, the love they had found, the life they had built together. "Remember that first day you rode up?" Delilah asked Silas one evening, a twinkle in her eye, a smile playing on her lips. "I thought you were trouble." Silas chuckled, his arm wrapping around her, drawing her close. "And you were right," he said, his voice filled with affection. "But I was also the best thing that ever happened to you." Delilah leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her heart filled with contentment. "And you were right about that," she said, her voice soft. "You were the best kind of trouble." They lived a long and full life, their love story a legend whispered throughout the town of Whispering Pines, a tale of redemption, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. When they were old and gray, their bodies weary, their spirits still strong, they passed away peacefully, within days of each other, their hands clasped together, their love a beacon that shone brightly even in death. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking Whispering Pines, their graves marked by a simple, stone monument, engraved with their names, the dates of their lives, and a single, poignant inscription, "Together, always." The ranch passed down through generations, a legacy of love, resilience, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. And the story of Delilah and Silas, the widow and the outlaw, lived on, a testament to the power of second chances, the transformative power of love, and the enduring beauty of a life well lived, a love story etched in the heart of the wilderness, forever.